Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Monday, December 22nd, 2025. Professor Glenn Diesen joins us now. Professor Diesen, always a pleasure. I know it's Christmas time and holiday time. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to go dark midday on Wednesday, and then we'll be quiet for about 10 days unless something happens that requires that we come on air and address it. Hopefully that won't be the case. Before I talk to you about the EU and its crimes, and they seem to be increasing every time we turn around, I want to ask you a few questions about the United States and China. In the past 2 weeks, the following events occurred. The Trump administration released its national security strategy, which says China is no longer an enemy, it's now an economic competitor. Yet last week, President Trump signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act, which delivers $11 billion worth of offensive missiles to Taiwan. And over the weekend, the United States Navy stopped and seized a Venezuelan oil tanker destined for the Panama Canal and ultimately to China. How do you think China will react to all that?
I think, quite poorly. But I think the U.S. Military approach, and I think there is a military approach because seeing China as an economic rival is one thing. But if there's a concern that the U.S. can't compete with China, perhaps because its economies become too financialized, perhaps because the Chinese have too much self-sufficiency and are able to scale everything, thus having an advantage in terms of implementation of AI and all of the other advantages. I think there will always be an incentive for the U.S. to use military force when it's not able to compete. But I think the Chinese are seeing the U.S. posture changing a bit because during the hegemonic era, when the U.S. dominated, its power derives to a large extent from being a security provider. That is, to offer its deterrent to allies who align with the U.S. But in a time of decline, I think it's in the interest of the U.S., as Washington sees it, to instead prepare some confrontation with other great powers to weaken them, but not directly, because you don't want to be directly in the war with China, but instead those allies who were previously under your umbrella would then instead be used more as vassals. So if you're going to fight the Russians, of course you use Ukrainians. You're going to fight Iraqis, you use Kurds. If you're going to fight the Chinese, you want to use the Taiwanese or Japanese. And so I think this is what they're getting more concerned about. And regarding Venezuela, I think that's another part of this national security strategy, which sees all of America as America's backyard, which means that the U.S. will begin to patrol more who's allowed to access and who's not allowed to access this region. And the first step, I think, is to cut off Russia and China, but particularly, most importantly, China from Venezuela.
But the consequences of stealing an oil tanker with oil destined for China have got to be something. I mean, either the Navy didn't know what they were doing or Trump doesn't know what he's doing, or both. I mean, they have to have thought about this. Our mutual friend and colleague Larry Johnson has suggested the Chinese will dump their American Treasury bonds. Well, that'll force the Treasury to have to offer higher interest rates, which means the United States government then has to borrow more money to pay the interest on borrowed money. Truly an absurd economic paradigm, but that's what they do. I mean, how would the U.S. react? Well, we know from history when the Russians did this, if the Chinese put offensive missiles in Havana.
Of course. Well, if I think it's quite predictable how the U.S. would respond if the Chinese began to hijack and take American oil tankers. So, of course, this is something the Chinese can't afford not to do anything about. If they do nothing, then this becomes the new normal. That is, U.S. or NATO can then begin to seize ships on the open sea from countries who it's in competition with. Now, I think, though, the Chinese, as you correctly pointed out, they don't want to go down the military route. Of course, the obvious lesson learned for the Chinese is if they want to trade with the world, they need to supplement their trade ties with a powerful military to make sure that their trade connections are secure. Second, it would also tie them closer to Russia for this purpose, that they have such a massive land border that there is no one who can disrupt their ties. But I think before going down the military route, of course, it's in the interest of China to use its economic instruments of power. And as you said, that the Chinese have plenty. They can cut off. They can begin to dump their treasury bonds. They can dump the use of the U.S. dollar in trade and reserves. They can impose some very strong sanctions on the U.S., especially on any rare earth such as antimony, which is needed for weapons. So they can essentially begin to demilitarize the United States. The good news is that they don't want to go down this road. But the bad news is it appears that the U.S. is pushing them to do exactly this, because either do this or just capitulate and accept that all your trade and economic power will depend on the goodwill of Washington.
I mean, is the U.S. stupid, or was this just a mistake to seize an enormous oil tanker destined for China?
I think it's just this priority which has been set, that Venezuela should be isolated, and in the context of this regime change, I think they're taking risks and incurring costs which they haven't really thought through yet, because again, this is annoying the Chinese, provoking the Russians, but also, America's not full of this backwards banana republics as it was in the past. You have big giants there, be it Brazil, for example. So it's and many of these are not happy about this gunboat diplomacy, and that's what it is. You have the U.S. Navy surrounding Venezuela, dictating who can trade with Venezuela, seizing or stealing its oil and tankers, and bombing boats which may or may not be part of some imaginary narco cartel.
What is your take on the so-called negotiations between Kirill Dmitriev for the Russians and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner for the Americans? I mean, we all know what Russia requires. We all know what those requirements are. We also all know from as recently as Friday, when he repeated them, President Putin is not going to change his mind. What do they talk about?
Well, I have no good answers there. I certainly do not know. I do know that both Dmitriev and Witkoff, they're primarily businessmen, so they would like to see the opportunities for improving bilateral relations between Russia and the United States. Of course, this is in the interest of both states. The Russians don't want excessive dependence on China. The U.S. doesn't want Russia to have excessive dependence on China. Of course, this does mean that the Russians would in any circumstance ally against the Chinese, certainly not. But it's always good to diversify your economic ties. So there are common interests, but the problem is you can't really advance the bilateral ties before we solve the Ukraine issue. And on the Ukraine issue, I don't see that much development. Every time it seems that the United States and Russia is getting closer, that is to have a common understanding about to solve the underlying causes. And again, this is a key word everyone should have in their brain, the underlying causes. And the Russians have said what they consider to be the underlying causes. It's the essentially the collapse of the European security order. That is, after the Cold War, we decided let's create a Europe where everyone belongs except Russia. And this unavoidably, creating this Europe without Russia unavoidably makes it a Europe against Russia, because now we're going to have NATO military bases along the entire border of Russia. If you have the populations which are divided, such you have in Moldova, Ukraine, or Georgia, then of course half the population have to be suppressed in order to make sure these countries lean towards the West. So they're not going to accept any of this. So they're not going to. So essentially, what the Russians are asking for is a lot. We have to rethink all the mistakes we've done over the past 30 years. So the idea that Witkoff and Dmitriev can come and, hey, let's put together a nice trade deal and just trust me, we're not going to do this. I mean, even if the trust was there, the Russians won't bet anything on trust because Trump can change his mind the next day. He can change his mind in 20 minutes, and he might not even be here for that long. So again, they don't address the main underlying causes of this conflict, and it is a very difficult thing to do. So the first step, of course, would be if the Europeans would actually allow themselves to talk to the Russians. This would be a good first step, but we're not quite there yet.
The effort to steal Russian assets in the Belgian banks, were you surprised at the outcome, or did you think that Scholz and Macron and Starmer would be able to browbeat the Belgian prime minister?
Well, on one hand, I thought it was too crazy to get through. On the other hand, I suspected that they might be able to get it through because, I mean, there's been so much acts against the national self-interest. We cut ourselves off, that is Europeans, from Russian energy, which results in our deindustrialization. Our deindustrialization results in the US deprioritizing Europe. So we keep undermining our own interest time and time again. So I could have gone both ways on this. But again, the problem is every time the Europeans do something crazy, all opposition is essentially smeared and censored as being, well, then you're with Putin. They even called Belgium the most important asset of Putin because they didn't fall in line by seizing all the money in Euroclear. But this is the problem. It's not about being pro-Putin, it's being pro your own national interest. And this thing now is even fragmenting Europe because it's a very divisive issue to essentially throw the rule of law to decide and find some essentially legalize theft. This is very extreme, and even though it didn't go through, it should be said that the EU nonetheless it suspended these rules that it would vote on the sanctions every 6 months, and now they just frozen these assets indefinitely. So it's already proving itself that is the EU is proving itself to be quite a hazard to Europe. And this is essentially what Elon Musk is saying. So that and also the US national security strategy, more or less wanting to liberate Europe from the EU. And instead of showing that it's a responsible actor, the EU is essentially showing that the national security strategy and Elon Musk are correct, that they are undermining Europe.
Here's Prime Minister Viktor Orban on Wednesday. It's not clear to me if this is before or after the vote, but it's very, very clear that the EU vote. It's very, very clear how he feels about it. Chris, cut number 11.
He wants more guarantees for the front.
Guarantees for what? The whole idea is a stupid one. To take away the money of somebody. There are two countries which are in war, yeah? It's not European Union, Russia and Ukraine. And somebody, European Union, would like to take away the money of one of the warriors party and then to give it to another one. It's a marching into the war. So the Belgian Prime Minister is right. We should not do that.
They have to.
That was right before the vote. I think he's right marching into the war. How was this treated in Europe by the elites, by the media, by the ordinary folk when this brainchild of Chancellor Merz collapsed and they came up instead with this $100 billion loan?
Well, first it should be said that Viktor Orban also made a different point. That is, when the EU now lends all of this money, that is 90 billion euros or 100 billion, the problem then is the only way it can get this money back is if the Russians repay all of that or pays it in reparation. And the only way you get Russian reparation if you defeat Russia. So the EU has now put itself in a position where if it don't go bankrupt, if it wants its money back, it has to then prolong the war, no matter how severe the consequences are also for Ukraine, but also steps towards nuclear war. So the EU is now in the business of war, and the peace is our enemy. This is more or less what Viktor Orban said as well, which is also correct. So it's an extremely dangerous thing that's been done. I think the Europeans are a bit split. For many countries, they are a bit, and people are concerned how far away this is going. To this point, I would consider this to be largely an elite project being driven. If you look at the polling of people like Starmer, Macron, or Merz, it's historically awful. They don't have much support for the policies. On the other hand, if you would ask the random person on the street, they would also find it difficult to criticize some of the things that are being done, because we more or less have now we're functioning almost like a cult, where either you agree with the government or you're with the enemy. And so there's not much dissent anymore in the media as well. And of course, we have some people who try to speak up. A colleague of mine, actually, a retired colonel of the Swiss army, that is in the Swiss intelligence, which is Colonel Jacques Beau, which you might have heard of. The EU actually sanctioned him. He used to work for NATO. They sanctioned him. They froze his bank accounts, put travel ban on him, because his analysis reached the wrong conclusions. I mean, they're really getting very desperate now, and this is criminal behavior. It's not. There's no way this can possibly be legal.
It's clearly criminal behavior. Our friend and colleague Gilbert Doctorow tells me he doesn't even think that the EU rules permit a judicial challenge to what they did. They silenced him. They won't let him travel, and they won't let him spend his own money. How could that possibly? Oh, because of his speech. He hasn't been convicted of a crime. How could that possibly be lawful?
Well, no. And if you go through the EU documents, they explain that this is because he's been making pro-Russian comments and rhetoric and talking points. First of all, you have to unpack what that comment means. What is pro-Russian? This is a very vague term. Has he said something positive about Russia? Has he not demonized them? Or has he taken Russia's side against the West? Because he only speaks. If this is his analysis that the West has provoked this war, that's not necessarily anti-Western or pro-Russian. That's just recognizing if we want to avoid nuclear war, and we want to avoid Ukraine being destroyed, if we have provoked this and Russia sees itself an existential threat, if you want peace, then you have to recognize, first get the right diagnosis in order to solve this. So it's full of these vague terms. And also, if you criminalize being pro-Russian, that's a very strange thing to criminalize as well. But even the argument that he was pro-Russian is that the one example they used in the sanction is they said that he had suggested that Ukraine invited Russia's invasion on itself. But all that the colonel did was he quoted the former advisor of that is Alexei Arestovich, the former advisor of Zelensky, top advisor of Zelensky, that is, who made this point in 2019 interview. He made the point that more or less a quote was, the price we have to pay for NATO membership is a big war with Russia, and we'll win this war. And he explained that if we try to join NATO, it will provoke the Russians to invade. When they invade, NATO will help us, and together we'll defeat the Russians. It will be the coolest thing ever, and this will be our ticket into NATO. He's quoting Zelensky's top advisor, and this is the reason the EU sanctions him for spreading so-called conspiracy theory.
And does he have no recourse? There's nothing he can do. He can't go to a judge and ask that the sanctions be removed because there was no due process.
God knows. It's again, the EU throws out the rule book, so it's very hard to say.
Where are these banks in Switzerland? Are the Swiss banks going to listen to the creeps in Brussels?
Well, hopefully not. Again, Switzerland's not in the European Union. I know the colonel lives in Brussels, so they're probably he has his bank accounts frozen. But the Swiss government has been very quiet considering what the EU has done to one of its colonels. No, it's really hard to say how they might actually respond to this. It's very bullying, but again, this is self-harm. It's not as if it's a pro-EU or pro-Europe argument to be in favor of this. The EU is destroying itself. It's showing how desperate it is. That mild criticism, I mean, if you're gonna accuse Colonel Beau of being a pro-Russian agent, I mean, then you really are in deep trouble. Then there's no dissent allowed anymore. I mean, this is his job. You assess what the opponent is afraid of and how to explain how they're reacting, which is a condition for resolving a crisis. The problem in Europe now, if you're not allowed to identify the security concerns of Russia, and that's more or less what the US said. The Russians don't need any security guarantees in any deal. Again, this is what the peace agreement needs: mutual security guarantees.
Well, the EU doesn't recognize the freedom of speech. I guess they could do this to Gilbert Doctorow He's going to be on Wednesday. I'll ask him about it. He lives in Brussels.
Yes, well, why not? This is not the end station. It's not as if this is where they'll stop. This is a pattern which it keeps escalating the crackdown on free speech. So no, everyone could be next. This is it's intimidation.
How did the EU come to this decision? Was there a vote, or did Mrs. von der Leyen just sign a piece of paper and ordered it to happen?
No, it came there from the council, if I'm not mistaken. That is, it's not the EU Parliament which had any say about this, and this is the big problem. Even if it would be able to be reversed at some point, let's say 2-3 years down the road, it's not necessarily the outcome; it's the process that's the punishment, and also the signal is sent to anyone else. If your analysis do not reach the same conclusion, that this is unprovoked by invasion by the most recent reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, then you might be sanctioned. We might freeze your accounts, make it impossible for you to essentially pay your bills, and you'll be evicted from your house. You have to leave the continent. You're not allowed to travel around anymore around the continent. I mean, this is what we have become. This is what Europe is now. Because
what happens if he tries to fly from Brussels to Zurich? He can't get on the plane?
I'm not sure how it works. Well, he would be leaving the EU to go to Switzerland, which is not the EU. But again, it is hard to ask. This is kind of new territory. This kind of way of sanctioning, just sanctioning Europeans, especially military, senior military people as well. But it seems like this is a new thing. Unless this has a proper and well-deserved consequence, that enough pushback, then they will essentially see this door as being kicked in, and now we can continue to do this against other people.
Wow, I don't know how this is going to end. And I would very much like to interview him. If we do, it'll be after the first of the year. Professor Diesen, thank you very much. Thanks for all the time you gave to us in 2025. As you may know, on Friday, we reached the 100 million view mark for the second year in a row, and you're not a small part of that, and I'm deeply grateful for all the time you spent with us. I hope you have a great holiday, and we'll look forward to seeing you in January.
Likewise. Merry Christmas, Judge.
Merry Christmas to you and to your family. Thank you, Professor. Coming up at 4 o'clock on whatever he wants to talk about, Scott Ritter, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.